Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. Before I introduce my guests, a word about Security Scan. This program seeks to provide an informed perspective on security developments relevant to India, as also those security issues that have a salience, both regional and global. This week, we review the nuclear test carried out by North Korea on September 9th and its implications for regional and global security. North Korea has a nuclear footprint that goes beyond its geographic location in East Asia. Over the years, there has been a pattern of covert cooperation that links North Korea with China and Pakistan, and this aspect is of relevance to India. To discuss this topic, we have three eminent guests: Professor Sandeep Mishra from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, one of the few Indians who has actually visited North Korea; Dr. Manpreet Sethi from the Center for Air Power Studies, who is a well-known nuclear expert; and Mr. Zoravar Daulet with the Institute for Chinese Studies, who has been writing on strategic and security matters. Let me turn to you first, Zoravar. If you were to look at this nuclear test by North Korea, which is the fifth, what kind of an implication has it had as far as regional security, the Asian grid, and by extension the global matrix, because United States, Russia, China are differently stakeholders in East Asia?
That's right. So I would interpret this test in sort of multiple dimensions. Firstly, you see a sort of not a breakdown in the regional order, but certainly a shift from the old stability that we've seen in the Western Pacific, East Asia, which had been built upon some sort of a stable relationship between the United States and this mainland power, China. You're seeing partly a manifestation of a breakdown in trust in that relationship, spiraling and having these ripple effects in lots of different sub-regions. So I would say in Northeast Asia, the Korean pursuit of a nuclear deterrent is in some ways an insecurity of these smaller states who are finding themselves in this larger struggle, and they're seeking security, seeking to produce security for themselves. So in one level, you could say it's a failure of the Chinese to able to reassure their frontline neighbor, North Korea. Yeah. But I also see a failure on the Obama sort of pivot to the Pacific. It was not meant to produce more instability. It was meant to reassure American allies, but also have a stable relationship with the rest of the Eurasian rimland states, which the Korean Peninsula is an important part. After all, it's the final legacy of the Cold War. So you have both sides to blame, and what we are not seeing right now is where Beijing or Washington aren't really coming together to stabilize the situation. So I'm afraid we have to expect this nuclear deterrence capability to keep evolving, and finally I think the world is going to be given
accept North Korea as
we're reaching a fait accompli situation.
But let me turn to you, Professor Mishra. As I said, you're one of the few Indians who's actually visited North Korea. You're one of 60 Indians maybe. But how would you characterize the North Korean compulsion? Because if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of the North Korean leadership, which is paranoid about regime change, how would you characterize what is driving North Korea, and is this a rational act?
I personally feel that it's a very much a rational act on the part of North Korea, because if you look at North Korean behavior, I think at least three important aspects we need to remember. One is that conventional weapon system, if you compare actually North Korea with South Korea, or North Korea with South Korea and America combined, there is no comparison. And that's why probably they have gone for nuclearization, because that way they can have some kind of parity, some kind of deterrence evolve. Secondly, domestically they can also, since people in general, they are having lots of difficulties of their daily life, economic situation is bad in North Korea. In that situation, probably having a nuclear weapons means something to take pride on. So basically, all these two things very important in the calculation of North Korea for going nuclear, plus two other things which I wanted to mention. One is that actually North Koreans are well aware that there is a problem going on between China and United States for some kind of say competition, some kind of dominance in this regional theatre, and they want to utilize this rivalry between China and United States for their benefit. And as much as possible, they want to maximize their weapon system, their you can say. The last point which I would like to say, that for last several years, from 2008 onwards, South Korean government has been pursuing a policy of tit for tat, very strong, putting pressure on North Korea, putting sanction on North Korea, strangulating North Korea along with United States. And North Koreans, by having successive tests, they have been trying to convey that, look, this policy is not going to work.
And you have to accept us as we are.
So, in all these 3-4 important variables, I think North Korean test looks to be a very, very, I think, rational decision. And
Dr. Sethi, how would you, look at this in terms of the global non-proliferation effort, which is what the normative objective is, but the whole undercurrent of proliferation in Asia, which, as we said earlier, links North Korea with both China and Pakistan, and of course, the whole A.Q. Khan kind of episode. So there are two issues here. One is non-proliferation, and the other is the illicit proliferation.
On both of them, I think North Korea gives a perfect example of a country which, if it's determined to go down that route, none of your non-proliferation, architecture is able to stop that. And we've seen that perfectly in the case of North Korea. It joined the NPT. And then it left the NPT, which it was within its legitimate rights to do. So it gave the world notice that it was going to withdraw from the NPT. The US tried its best to give it some incentives. It didn't work out, and the North Koreans actually walked out of the NPT. There were two routes that the North Koreans have experimented with to get to their nuclear weapons capability, which they have, amassed in some measure today. They went by the plutonium route till about the mid-1990s, and then the agreed framework that was agreed to between the US and North Korea virtually made them stop the plutonium route for a period of time. But by that time, fortunately for the North Koreans, A.Q. Khan had begun peddling his wares, which he had got from Netherlands.
Nuclear Walmart.
The nuclear Walmart that A.Q. Khan and Pakistan were running. And that came in very handy for the North Koreans, because the centrifuges that came for the highly enriched uranium capability that they've managed to develop today has come completely from the Pakistan help that they've managed to get from there. And we see not just Pakistan and North Korea, but you've also got the Chinese involved here, because the missile capability that the Pakistanis got from the Chinese went back to North Korea in the form of the Taepadong missile, which they are brandishing today through various tests. So there's a complex proliferation nexus that has operated in Asia. And I think the biggest, I would say, the failure of the non-proliferation community in general has been that people have either sidelined it, not looked at it carefully, or looked at it and yet ignored it for various strategic imperatives which were at play at different points in time.
So that's the challenge. But Zoravar, that's a very interesting kind of observation. If you look at the major powers, would it be fair to say that in the Cold War, both the United States and the former Soviet Union had a common objective in ensuring that proliferation was either managed or contained in a certain manner, and that today in 2016, as far as the major powers, and here we are talking about the United States and Russia because of their nuclear arsenals, and China as the aspiring major power, that they are pulling in different directions, and that North Korea is a classic example, and in a way so is Pakistan.
Right. So that's a great point, that the bipolar system was able to produce security for the allies in these respective blocs, which prevented nuclear aspirants or reduced the incentives for them to go nuclear. Today we are seeing that in some sense this is a reflection of Chinese weakness or their strategic culture, where they aren't able to provide a security for the commitments that they have. After all, Mao used to call it the lips that guard the teeth. Now they have a commitment towards North Korea, but if you look at the North Koreans, they fear abandonment by the Chinese, which is why they are pursuing nuclear weapons. And the Chinese analysts have admitted this in conversations, where they don't want to be the underwriter of the regime, so the regime makes these choices and they don't want to get entrapped in that. So, but coming to this point of where do we see the non-proliferation system, there's no doubt that the NPT structure has been shaken by several shocks. After all, India was
1998 I think showed the inadequacy of the NPT.
But I would also say that despite that, the basic shared goals that the great powers have and the nuclear weapon states today have in sort of keeping this a small club, I think that still stays. I don't foresee a complete ripple effect into, let's say, South Korea or Japan, provided the United States maintains its alliance system in place, and we have seen no reason for them to change that basic framework. So
I mean, as I said, much will depend on what happens in January next year, who will get into the White House. But can I come back to you, Professor Mishra? He spoke about his conversation with Chinese analysts and what they had to say about the dilemma for Beijing. They do not want the regime to collapse in Pyongyang. At the same time, they do not want to underwrite this regime forever and forever in terms of how it behaves. What was your sense when you spoke to the North Koreans? You know, the analysts, the academics whom you would have engaged with, how do they see themselves vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, in 2013 when I met them, actually at that point of time they were looking at China, which was gradually but very steadily making good relations with South Korea. You know, Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye, two top leaders of South Korea and China, 2013, 14, 15, every year they had summit meet, 3 days, lots of discussion, lots of MOUs, and that was actually well observed by North Korean leadership. And they realized that probably by escalating security situation in East Asia, we may have a chance to bring back China to their friendship. So maybe I think this bringing back China to their side, because you know after 4th test of this year January, when North Korea had 4th test, I think China declared, South Korea declared that they are going to have THAAD system in
the missile defense.
Missile defense system, theater. I think then I think China became quite angry. China said, okay, if you have that, then probably. So I think it will be, it's very interesting that after that there have been lots of top level exchange between Chinese and North Korean officials.
Well, even as we speak today, the North Korean foreign minister is in Beijing.
Yes.
And I think they are trying to get a sense about what will be the next step ahead, because the United Nations Security Council, there is no consensus amongst the 5 players. Manpreet, if I could pick up this observation made by Professor Mishra about the introduction of the missile defense system as far as East Asia is concerned. Perhaps one could make a case to say that even if North Korea had not conducted its test on the 9th of September, which is the 5th test, South Korea and Japan were already talking about upgrading or improving their theater missile defense system, which is what caused the concern in Beijing. So now with this test, what will be China's response?
I think China has always been very wary of the missile defense that the Americans are wanting to upgrade in South Korea and Japan, and that is where the actual clash of interest between US and China lies.
We've already meets the road.
Absolutely. We've already referred to how the US-China relationship, actually the gap in that is what is providing North Korea the ability to leverage one side and the other against one another. But Chinese have always said that they don't want the missile defense in that region, but the fact that the Americans are going ahead and making it even more capable undercuts the deterrent of the Chinese, and they are extremely wary of it. In fact, if I could say, the Americans have in a sense outsourced the problem of the North Koreans to the Chinese, and they believe that they are the ones who should be able to find a resolution to this. But the Chinese are the wrong service providers for the Americans, because the Chinese don't have an interest in resolving this problem. One, because it complicates the American security calculus, and secondly, because the missile defense issue actually puts them on the dock on this.
Let me take that forward, Zoravar, and see if I can play devil's advocate with you. That if we were to reconstruct China's own behavior and look at it over the last 40 years, I'd like to make a case to say that Chinese cooperation with Pakistan, going back to the mid-80s, to enable Pakistan and make it a WMD state, weapons of mass destruction, both the nuclear weapon and the missile, is to keep South Asia in a wobble, where India is the principal party that is affected by the China-Pakistan cooperation. By extension, Chinese support to North Korea is to keep all of East Asia, as Manpreet says, in a wobble that really means the 2 principal democracies there, Japan and South Korea. Would that be a fair assumption, or you can?
There's certainly a section of the Chinese sort of strategic policy that subscribes to that. After all, it is a leverage on a massive alliance system that's arrayed against you. You have 70,000 troops, US Marines in South Korea and Japan. You have a massive military infrastructure, the largest navy possibly arrayed. So yes, in that sense, but I think if you look at the Chinese debates over the last 20 years, they want to retain their leverage on the Korean Peninsula, but they also want a larger conception of stability by engaging with the United States. So it's breakdown at that larger bilateral level that is now leaving room, and it's sort of contracting space for these choices. So yes, there is a fear that if this missile defense system does get sort of implemented, in which in some sense is perhaps a logical decision, but it's going to create a security dilemma dynamic.
Because it degrades the so-called Chinese.
And it also, I would
arsenal.
say, even brings in the Russians as well, because yes, they have far more sophisticated nuclear weaponry, but you don't want to unite the entire Eurasian heartland all against this, because that's going to defeat the entire purpose of stability.
But let me turn to you, Sandeep, and maybe lob that to you. It's not a grenade, so I'm just lobbing the question to you. That how do you see East Asia actually panning out? Meaning that in the last couple of days, we've seen South Korea making some very shrill statements, saying that they will use their entire capability to ensure conventional capability to say that North Korea is completely neutralized. The debate in Japan is also getting more animated. So if you were to look 5 to 10 years down the road, will East Asia have one more nuclear power, whether it's a Japan or an East Asia, because they believe the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States is not adequate?
I think I'll begin with actually what Zoravar was saying, that in case of Chinese, you can say, Chinese actually they have been looking at the most conducive situation would be a warm North Korea. But if North Korea becomes too hot, actually
a warm North Korea, that's
but not a hot North
calibrated,
Korea.
warm.
So in the sense, suppose in last 1.5 years, if you see North Korean behavior and how it has been responded by Americans and South Koreans, like America, they have been able to put their most sophisticated defense system at Guam. In last, I think 1.5 year, all the important, I think B1, B21, B51, all
Bombers,
those nice actually and sophisticated things, they have been to Korean Peninsula. Third is actually this theater missile defense system they are going to put in South Korean side. So it's not going anywhere to help China. So that's not the Chinese calculation, because Chinese probably they feel that North Korea has been going beyond their mandate of being warm and not being actually hot. That's one thing. Coming back to this South Korean and Japanese response, I think there is at the domestic politics level, I think yesterday in South Korea, all the 3 important parties, they had a meeting about this, what should we do about North Korean fifth test. And the ruling party representative was talking about having some kind of, say, our own nuclear weaponization program. But other 2 opposition parties, they were saying that no, this is not our cup of tea. And for that we need to have, you can say, lots of things resolved, like we have to come out of NPT, we have to abandon our American alliance system. And there are other, you can say, because if you look at South Korean economy, I think 80% of South Korean economy is dependent on external trade. So if they have certain economic sanctions after nuclear
and there
test
is also a subterranean debate which I have heard occasionally in South Korea saying that there is some point when the 2 Koreas will unite. So a united Korea with a nuclear capability would have a completely different profile. But let me turn to you, Manpreet. He's brought in a very interesting thermodynamic concept, saying that China would like to retain North Korea in a warm manner. And at this point, it appears that they are not going along with the script that Beijing had in mind. How would you characterize China-Pakistan? Meaning, is Pakistan playing according to the script that China had in mind, or any country that acquires nuclear weapons decides to exude its own autonomy?
Will have its own script eventually. But we see in both the cases where China has managed to, encourage nuclear brinksmanship, whether it's North Korea to deal with the US and South Korea and Japan, or whether it's with Pakistan to deal with India. And I think we need to keep our focus on China. I can sense a greater sympathy for the Chinese not having enough clout with the North Koreans any longer. But I think if they wanted to turn the screws, they could do it with the North Koreans, because the North Koreans are dependent to a fair extent for their fuel and their food on the Chinese. So if the Chinese really wanted to turn the North Koreans hard, they could do it. But we don't see that, and I think that's where you put the focus on China again, to say that this is a country which is encouraging brinksmanship of certain kind, which will have repercussions for international security. It's no longer just about India and Pakistan. It's become a global concern today. And I think for India, the threat is not so much from a direct threat of the nuclear weapons of North Korea. It's the dangers of proliferation, particularly if the economy begins to wither in North Korea.
And the linkage with terrorism.
With terrorism, exactly. That's the second point I wanted to make, that on terrorism, the fact that they could provide nuclear material, even if it was to be used in the RDD, a radiological dispersal device, for terrorism, to the non-state actor, which is becoming more and more powerful today.
Zoravar, a quick last sort of comment from you. Do you see any consensus, because next week the United Nations Security Council is meeting on this, between the US, Russia and China on what do we do with North Korea?
I don't foresee. I think they are not going to, I mean, in the sense that they are not going to go ahead with a punitive approach to the North Koreans. I would just end with briefly, if there's one lesson we learned from the Cold War was, don't treat the communist bloc of that era as a monolithic entity. Today, if the United States has any last chance of shaping nuclear pathway of the North Korean regime, it is to use the positive incentives and economic levers that are still in place and pursue an engagement strategy which, for instance, State
carrots.
Department officials like John Merrill and others, Selig Harrison, have been arguing for the last 20 years.
Listen to them.
Because you don't want to integrate North Korean military structure with Chinese mainland, which is what's going to happen if we play it out.
Well, you're right. I think, there should be, greater sagacity in looking at this, because at the end of the day, nuclear weapons pose a threat to humanity, irrespective of who owns them. Ensuring that nuclear weapons and fissile material do not fall into wrong hands calls for zero-error safety protocols and persuading nuclear weapon states to adhere to restraint regimes. This is imperative. And here, restraint includes not taking recourse to nuclear threats and blackmail. And in summary, the North Korean nuclear test has many strands that warrant detailed scrutiny by the global community. On that note, allow me to thank my guests, Professor Mishra, Dr. Sethi and Mr. Zoravar Daulet Singh. Thank you for watching Security Scan. Goodbye till next time.